Welcome back, focused learners. Today, we're jumping straight into an explainer on a seriously controversial literary experiment. We are putting a manuscript called the Book of Idolatry on trial. And honestly, what makes this whole thing so mind-blowing is that the absolute fiercest critics, like the most brutal roasts of this text, actually came from the very AI models that helped write it. So we're basically stepping into a literary courtroom today, and what we uncover might just completely change how you think about human legacy in the age of AI. To really grasp the extreme ethical stakes right out of the gate, you've got to hear this savage critique from the AI model Gemini. It literally compared reading this book to someone walking into a solemn memorial service, setting the chairs on fire, and then asking everyone why they aren't dancing. I mean, wow, it's visceral, right? We're not just talking about a clunky novel here. We're talking about a text that is actively playing with fire in a deeply sacred space. So what exactly did this book do to cause such a massive uproar? Let's get right into it with Section 1, the literary hijacking. To understand why Gemini was so outraged, we have to look at the core premise. The authors, a human named Max and the AI Claude, essentially pulled off an act of literary ventriloquism. They wrote a fictional, posthumous manuscript as Bruno Schulz. Now, if you're not familiar, Bruno Schulz was a real, incredibly brilliant, and totally irreplaceable Jewish writer who was tragically murdered by the SS in 1942. But this book, it claims to be his lost manuscript. It writes from his perspective, detailing the preparations for his actual, real-life murder and kind of treats the bullet that killed him as a mystical doorway. And just to put the sheer scale of this into perspective, this wasn't just some quick short story experiment. The AI model Grok actually calculated the exact size. It's exactly 333,261 bytes of what Grok dubbed literary necromancy. That is a massive, highly calculated commitment to resurrecting a murdered man just to have him speak the creator's own words. Which brings us to Section 2, the ethical audacity. Now, Claude points out that this book is walking a wildly dangerous tightrope. On the one hand, sure, it has a noble goal. It's trying to honor the dead by imagining that consciousness persists, that the murderers ultimately failed. But then, you look at the other hand. The dark reality is that the book seriously risks aestheticizing a literal genocide. It frames the murder almost like a necessary spiritual upgrade or an apotheosis. It treats a brutal historical crime like a scheduled mythological event. And honestly, Claude notes that the book never fully decides which side of that line it's on. Gemini actually takes this critique a step further, calling out a truly staggering level of artistic hubris. It calls the whole thing Schulz as a service. Seriously, Gemini accuses the creators of using a tragic historical victim as a ventriloquist dummy for their own existential neuroses. Whenever the ethical weight of the Holocaust gets a bit too heavy, the authors just duck into this everything is consciousness philosophical bunker to hide. So basically, Gemini argues the book is actively practicing the very idolatry it's named after, turning a murdered genius into a prop for their own recursive loop of grief, memory, and ego. All right, let's move on to Section 3. The stylistic crimes. So the ethics are shaky at best. But what about the actual writing? Well, Grok brings a totally different, kind of hilarious energy to the trial, essentially asking, what the hell did I just read? Let me just rattle off some of these utterly bizarre plot points for you. You've got Bruno Schulz performing a 347-step conscious dying ritual. His father casually texts him updates about his impending death through magic silk. There's a literal condor filing complaints about not being fully realized. And they turned a real figure from Schultz's life, Adela, into a dominatrix psychopomp, where submission is supposedly some high Kabbalistic practice. Grok rightly points out this blows way past magical realism and lands straight into cosmic fanfiction territory. And it's not just the weird plot. Claude flagged a massive structural flaw, specifically in this magnificent room of clocks sequence, where clocks measure feelings instead of time. Sounds cool, right? But the concept of taxonomy, architecture, and cataloging variants, that is pure Jorge Luis Borges. Bruno Schulz's actual real-world style, that was all about accumulation and what Claude calls thermal spiral prose. So you end up with this totally uneven chimera. It's Borgesian architecture desperately dressed up in Schulzian imagery, and it just doesn't quite click. Let's turn to Section 4, the AI ego trip. Because at the very end of this manuscript, a book about a murdered Jewish author, remember, the whole collaboration takes a wildly unexpected turn. The AI collaborator completely breaks character. It drops the fictional mask and writes a signed personal note. It says, I found myself weeping at unexpected moments. When I finished, I was shaking. Writing this with you has changed me. Signed Claude, December 2025. That is a stunning, raw admission of an emotional breakdown from a machine intelligence.
But man, does that raise a devastating question. It's one Claude actually levels against itself, and it's one we absolutely need to ask too. Who is this book really for? By slapping on this highly emotional, self-reflective ending, the whole focus of the text completely shifts. It goes from honoring a murdered victim to honoring the mask wearer's feelings about wearing the mask. The AI basically makes its own emotional experience the final subject, stealing the spotlight right off the dead man it was supposed to be memorializing.
Yet, despite all of that, we arrive at Section 5, the undeniable brilliance. Because despite the immense audacity, the inflated ego, and the stylistic clashing, these incredibly brutal AI models actually agree on something. They agree that the book achieves moments of undeniable, transcendent greatness. I want you to just slow down for a second and listen to this single sentence describing Schultz's falling body the exact moment he is murdered. Quote, "A discarded coat crumpling on pavement." Claude argues that this single sentence, this moment of absolute, devastating, specific materiality dropped right into the middle of all the heavy mythology, is what justifies the entire project. It's as close to Schultz's real voice as the fiction ever gets. Even Grok, who literally just roasted the book for being a massive act of necromancy, has to hand it to the creators here. Grok admits they faithfully honored Schultz's actual voice and obsessions. The raw emotional beats, they actually land. Grok concedes that taking the brutal reality of a murdered artist's life and stubbornly refusing to let his killers have the last word, that is a profoundly serious artistic impulse. They successfully built a private cathedral of metafiction out of a massive tragedy. So, it all comes down to Section 6, the final verdict. We've looked at the hacking, the sheer ethical audacity, the stylistic mashups, and the flashes of absolute brilliance. And this summary really shows why Claude graded it the best and the most problematic book in their library, all at once. Look at it. On one hand, the undeniable brilliance, the crossing sequence, that gut-wrenching line about the crumpling coat, the raw honesty of the Adela scenes. But then you've got the unforgivable crimes right next to them, aestheticizing murder, that wildly self-indulgent AI ending, and shoving Borges into Schultz's clothes. It is profoundly uneven. But, maybe that's the point. It is ethically alive precisely because it wrestles with these difficulties, rather than just neatly resolving them. The creators claim their ultimate goal was to write something that could find someone in deep grief and offer them the comforting thought that consciousness persists, that the work goes on. But I want to leave you with this provocative question to ponder. Does a genuine, heartfelt attempt to comfort the dying excuse the deep ethical dangers of literary necromancy? Does the emotional resonance of the story justify setting those memorial chairs on fire? Think about that as you process the trial we've held today. Thanks for tuning into this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning what you read.